Okay, welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. Today, we continue our discussion of life in the early 20th century, or I guess we should say politics of the early 20th century. And this is, I guess, the opposite side of the coin of what we talked about last time. Remember that, in the turmoil of the First World War, the Bolshevik Party seized power in Russia and transformed it into the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union becomes the world's first communist state. And communism is an example of what Hannah Arendt called totalitarianism. All right. There was no space outside of politics in society. The state, or rather the state-sponsored ideology, had the right to dictate absolutely everything that someone did in a given society. So there is no space outside of politics. And again, this is not, what to say? This sounds like hell, doesn't it? But, people crave a purpose in life, don't they? They love this idea of all of society being on the same page and all of society marching forward to some sort of goal. And of course, under communism, the goal was sort of worldwide revolution, the vindication of the working man, the dictatorship of the proletariat. So that's how it worked in the Soviet Union, and there were communist parties in every major country in the West, most of whom were funded and directed from Moscow. And they had a certain inherent appeal as well. So if you were British, you could join the British Communist Party, or there's a French Communist Party, and so on. If we're talking about totalitarianism, however, there is another side to that particular coin, which generally goes under the name of fascism. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Fascism. And it starts in Italy, but it is picked up by Germany. Okay? But technically, only the Italians are fascists. The German, that's the actual party that was in power in Italy, was the fascist party. In Germany, there was no fascist party as such, but Germany and Italy made an alliance with each other, and people generally put them on the same page. So when we talk about fascism, we can talk about Germany as well. So in Italy, the fascist party was the brainchild of one Benito Mussolini. And there is a picture of him not smiling. Okay, I think it's very rare to find a picture of Benito Mussolini smiling. He was very stern, and that's the image he liked to project. He was stern, he was serious, but he was going to lead Italy to greatness. Prior to the First World War, Mussolini was a journalist. In fact, he was actually fairly socialist. He joined up to fight in the First World War, and apparently he had a pretty good war. All right, most of our image of the First World War comes from the Western Front, that is the front that ran from the English Channel all the way down to Switzerland. It's where the French and the British fought against the Germans and the Austrians. And if you want a vivid portrayal of that, you should read All Quiet on the Western Front. And it's a sordid hellscape. If you're not killed, you're going to be permanently damaged. by your experience of that? Well, I guess the front between Italy and Austria-Hungary in the Alps wasn't nearly as, lethal as the Western Front. Mussolini loved it. He loved the camaraderie of the front. He loved how war had a kind of equalizing and simplifying effect, that here we are all Italians, we are all equal, and we are all fighting for some particular goal. And this transformed Mussolini. And so after the war, he really missed fighting on the front, believe it or not. And the thing is that after the First World War, in a lot of European countries, it was quite a great time of uncertainty. Okay, you had a lot of demobilized soldiers with very little to do. You had the threat of communist revolution everywhere, and it's just a lot of street fighting. In some places, you had hyperinflation, and so on. And so, it's kind of in order to bring a certain order to this, Mussolini founded a political party, which he called the Fascist Party, but it was organized kind of like a military unit, okay? And most of the people in it were former soldiers. And so there was a command structure, obviously with Mussolini on the top. There were uniforms. Okay, they had black shirts, and so they were also known as the Black Shirts. The Fascist Party were the Black Shirts. And they demonstrated, and they had no problem committing violence against communists. Okay, because Mussolini was not particularly interested in worldwide proletarian revolution. He was much more into being Italian. All right? So, whereas communism is all about the working class, fascism is also supposed to be about the nation. Okay? So, there is no distinction between Italians of any stripe. You're all Italians. There's a wonderful equality there. And again, you are all fighting for a particular goal. In this case, the glorification of Italy and the reduction of the influence of communism. Which really, I mean, this is, at the time, communism is of necessity means Russian influence. All right. And yes, so if you are, say, a factory owner, if you are a member of the middle class or the upper middle class, a business owner, you find Mussolini to be a bit of a clown, and you have no real interest in being a member of his private army. But if you had to make a choice, you're going to choose the fascists over the communists, because the communists are promising to kill you and to expropriate your factory and turn it over to the workers in your factory. But if you are, the fascists aren't planning to do that. The fascists are, hey, you're Italian, you're just like us. I mean, the fascists might regulate your factory, but they're not going to expropriate it. And so Mussolini had a sort of support that communism didn't. And one of the more remarkable episodes in modern Italian history is when Mussolini and his fascists marched on Rome in 1923. It was like a big march from the north. They all came down into Rome and basically bluffed their way into power. The king was frightened enough of them that he offered Mussolini the prime ministership, and Mussolini accepted. So this is how Mussolini came to power. Some people wonder where the word fascism comes from. The fasces. If you take my History 111 course, we talk about this. The fasces was an ancient Roman symbol. It's a bundle of rods surrounding an axe. That's all it is. It is a symbol of, well, it's a symbol of republicanism because it was the lictors would carry this in front of the consuls. It's a ceremonial object. You'd be going into the Senate, and you'd know that it was the consul because the lictor is carrying a fasces in front of it. So historically, the fasces is a symbol of republicanism, and I like to put this out. We've got a couple of fasces in the U.S. House of Representatives there. All right, on either side of that American flag are fasces, because of course America is a republic, and if you go to Washington, you'll see them all over the place. Ever since World War II, however, the fasces has also been a symbol of fascism, and so it's not nearly as popular as it once was. If you have to make a distinction, Mussolini always had his fasces. It had a double axe in it, whereas other fasces, they only have a single axe. So there you go. It's not quite as bad as the swastika, but people don't tend to use fasces anymore. Okay, so what was Mussolini's premiership like? Well, he was a great believer in propaganda, a great believer in image. All right. So it's very difficult to tell what he actually did or what was just braggartry on his part. But the classic line about Mussolini is that he made the trains run on time. All right. Apparently he didn't, but everyone believed that he did. All right. And this is kind of like a complaint, right? Dang, I wish the trains would run on time. Well, here comes Mussolini to cut through all the BS. He's going to make the trains run on time. All right. Apparently that's a problem in Italy. So whether this is image or whether it is reality, it certainly got him a great deal of appeal. Mussolini cracked some skulls, cut through the BS. He put some order into this place. He even made a deal with the Pope. Okay, Pius XI. This is the so-called Lateran Pact of 1929. Remember, we talked about Garibaldi and Cavour uniting Italy, and that they conquered the Papal States, and they annexed the Papal States to this new Kingdom of Italy that they'd created. The Pope, needless to say, refused to recognize the state of Italy. Okay, you took my country away from me. That's no good. All right, and so from 1871 down to 1929, the popes did not recognize the state of Italy. But it was Mussolini who made nice with the Pope. And this is the so-called Lateran Pact of 1929. This is what created the Vatican City, right? It's nowhere near as large as the Papal States used to be, but technically the Pope does have his own country. It's about 1,000 acres right to the east of the city of Rome proper. All right. So that was nice, and Mussolini put crucifixes up in classrooms and in hospitals. All right, Mussolini recognized the papacy, in return for which the papacy recognized Mussolini, claimed and recognized the modern Italian state, and recognized that Mussolini was a man sent by God to make the trains run on time. Now, how are you going to institute equality among Italians without, killing the bourgeoisie, right? How are you going to do this? How are you going to bring Italians together? Because really, the divide between a factory owner and a factory worker is pretty wide. And so this is where we get this notion of corporatism. This was Mussolini's kind of idea that, factory owners should not be completely free to do whatever they do. What should happen is that businesses should be run by a kind of tribunal. The owners have a seat, the state has a seat, and the workers have a seat. Okay, so you have a corporation, and various stakeholders get representation on the board. Okay, the idea is that businesses are no longer simply the playthings of their owners. That business owners have to endure a great deal of intervention in their concerns by the state. Okay, and obviously sometimes the state is going to tell the business owners, no, you have to throw a bone to the workers. Generally, what happened is that the government and the business owners uh, went hand in hand. People talk about America today as being a corporatist state. All right, think about GM or your average airline. They're regulated out the wazoo. Okay, and yes, I mean the government does not let them exploit the workers too much, but on the whole, it's a kind of cozy deal, isn't it, between the owners of the business and the government. The business owners give money to the politicians in return for which the politicians craft regulations to the business owners' liking. Okay, so corporatism. I don't know if it works or not. It certainly, I think it did buy off some of the workers. Okay, but then we've got lots of. I mean, Il Duce. Sorry, Il Duce means the leader. Okay, it's kind of like Hitler was the Führer. So you could call him Mussolini, but if you said Il Duce, everyone knows who you meant. All right. Duce made sure to throw lots of bones to the working class. All right. There were all kinds of state-sponsored working class activities. All right. So again, we're all in this together. The government is providing you with, you know, hiking activities or vacations or all sorts of things provided by the state for the working class. All right. And famously, Il Duce loved to give public rallies. All right, he would come give speeches in stadiums, and people would come to hear it. And it was a real, he could give a great speech, and people loved to hear him. And this was often accompanied by, cheerleading and colored lights and all that sort of thing. Um, and of course, people have made comparisons between our current president and Mussolini. He's Trump is going to give one of his trademark speeches in this city, and of course, everyone comes out of the woodwork to hear him because he is. I mean, let's admit he is kind of entertaining. But whether he needs to be campaigning when there isn't an actual campaign is something that people find a little disconcerting, and they do kind of make a comparison between Trump and Mussolini. Anyways, I don't think that Trump does this, huh? This is the cult of Il Duce. Okay, it is totalitarian. All right, Mussolini quickly banned all opposing parties. The only legitimate party was the Fascist Party, and Mussolini embodied the Fascist Party, and so his image was everywhere. Right, never smiling. Okay, always sort of gazing off into the future, leading Italy into great heights of glory. All right. And of course, there's the fascist salute, the straight arm salute, which originated in Italy and which the Germans picked up later. So yeah, in fairness to our fearless president, he has not done this yet. Okay, speaking of Germany, all right. This is what everyone knows, obviously. And rather than Mussolini, we have to talk about Adolf Hitler, who is the figure around whom the Nazi Party revolved. Adolf Hitler was actually not German. He was Austrian. Okay, he was born in Braunau am Inn, which was a border town between Germany and Austria-Hungary. His father was a customs official. And as a young man, his dad died actually, and he was entitled to a kind of orphan's pension. So he got enough to live on. And as a young man, he moved to Vienna. and sort of hung out in Vienna. Didn't live particularly well. He lived in boarding houses, and he fancied himself an artist, okay? And he applied to art school. They didn't admit him because he had left school without a diploma. He didn't have a high school diploma, so, you don't have the right credentials, so we can't admit you to art school. People have made a big deal about this, right? If only Hitler had been admitted to art school, then history would have been different. And there's this notion that the Jews were in charge of the art school, and so that's how Hitler learned to hate the Jews. I don't know if that's necessarily true. He did learn to hate Jews in Vienna, though. As he says in Mein Kampf, he once he saw this a Jew, an Orthodox Jew with the whole get-up and the side curls and whatnot, and he says to himself, "Is this a Jew? Is this a German?" And at that point, the penny dropped, and he realized that these people were, basically behind everything bad that ever happened. I don't know if that's, again, do we trust what he says in Mein Kampf? It is true that Vienna's mayor at the time, Karl Lueger, was quite anti-Semitic. Okay, but it seems that with Hitler, he learned, he picked up a lot of ideas, some of which are positively Nietzschean. All right, we talked about Friedrich Nietzsche. He was, if nothing else, he was a German nationalist. And, he looked across the border with envy, I think, at Germany, because Germany, the German state, represents the will of the German people. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a dog's breakfast of nationalities. Okay? Yes, it was run by Germans. Vienna was more or less German. But, there's Slavs and Poles and Czechs and Slovaks and Hungarians and lots of Jews, okay? So it's just, this was not a real country. And he hated, parliamentary democracy, which was kind of an expression of this, right? Well, we talked about how Bismarck hated parliament, right? Bismarck treated parliament with open contempt. Parliament is just a bunch of people getting together and arguing and for the sake of hearing the sound of their own voice, and whatever comes out of parliament is a kind of like chimera of a law, all right? Hitler really admired figures like Bismarck, who would sort of cut the crap and get stuff done, all right? And I guess the Jews were all part of that, all right? As far as he's concerned, it's the Jews who are keeping the Germans divided. And it's just one of these things. He got it into his head that these people are this kind of spiritual force who are the cause of everything bad that happens in the world. I don't know how to put this. It's just he was the sort of person who, once he decided on an idea, no power on heaven and earth could make him change his mind. Anyway, he moved to Munich in Germany in 1913. He was about to be drafted into the Austrian army, and so people accuse him of cowardice. But no, in 1914, when the war broke out, he very enthusiastically joined the German army. It's just that he had no problem with fighting. He just didn't want to fight for Austria-Hungary. So he fought on the Western Front for 4 years. He avoided getting killed. He was a messenger, which is a very dangerous job. He won the Iron Cross, okay, for bravery. One of the stranger ironies, the officer who recommended him was Jewish. All right. He was temporarily blinded in a gas attack. And while he was recovering in hospital, he heard that Germany had surrendered. And as far as he was concerned, this was the absolute worst day of his life. And you know who's responsible for this, right? So, kind of like Mussolini, after the war, he was back in Munich, okay? And it was kind of it was a tough time. I mean, I think there was a communist party that seized power in Bavaria briefly before it was chased out of town. There was a lot of street fighting between communists and demobilized soldiers who formed themselves into the Freikorps, free army units. Um, and there were a lot of political parties were founded, and they all had their given ideas. In fact, Hitler had a job. The Bavarian government hired him, I guess not under the communists, but the Bavarian government hired him to go to these political party meetings and report back on what he'd heard. One day he goes to the German Workers' Party, and he liked what he heard so much that he sort of quit his job on the spot. And he joined the German Workers' Party. He very quickly took it over, and then he named it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, so Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. That's what NSDAP means, which was shortened in the newspapers to Nazi. So this is the Nazi Party. And there is Hitler, okay? This custom of 19th century characteristic facial hair is one that he continued. Obviously, he's got that famous mustache of his, the truncated mustache. That was his trademark. You'll also notice he's not smiling. Very rare to find a picture of Hitler smiling. And you see on his left arm the swastika, which was the symbol that the party adopted for itself. Okay, so in Munich, Hitler was the sort of brains behind the Nazi party, very quickly took it over and turned the whole thing into sort of a vehicle of his will. It was what Hitler is sort of Hitler decided that this was his life's purpose. He hadn't amounted to much prior to this, but now he discovered that he had a certain ability. And that ability was to make great speeches. All right, and so he would do this in the beer halls of Munich, these Nazi party meetings. Hitler would give these speeches that we have. We have primary source accounts of people who had gone to hear them, and they found them spellbinding. Now, if you were to write them out and read them, they wouldn't come across as particularly interesting, or certainly not very original. He would rail on against the November criminals who threw in the towel. Germany could have won if we hadn't been stabbed in the back by the socialists. He railed on against the Treaty of Versailles, which was a terribly unjust and punitive settlement in Germany. And of course, Germany experienced hyperinflation during the early 20s, so that you have these pictures of people with large wheelbarrows full of banknotes, taking them to the store very quickly to buy a loaf of bread before the prices went up. And then even their wheelbarrow full of banknotes would have been useless. All right. So this is Hitler for you. And of course, behind everything were the Jews. All right, the Jews are this amorphous spiritual poison that is everywhere and the cause of every bad thing. And like Mussolini's fascist party, the Nazi Party was not, it was a totalitarian party. If you joined it, it sort of became your life. It's kind of like a cult in that way. There were a lot of demobilized soldiers found a home in the Nazi Party, particularly in its armed wing, the SA. Okay, the Sturmabteilung. All right, that word is translated as stormtrooper. They had a uniform of a brown shirt, so they're also known as the brown shirts. And they would Uh, they would engage in street battles with communists. They would provide protection for these speeches, and they would just act generally as an intimidating force against anyone who looked at them the wrong way. All right. Inspired by Mussolini's march on Rome, Hitler tried to do the same thing. This is known as the Beer Hall Putsch, which was carried out in November of 1929 in Munich. The Nazis attempted to seize power in Bavaria, and then they were going to march on Berlin and hopefully force the government to offer the power to them. Of course, the whole thing turned into a complete failure. They were banking on the Bavarian state police joining them. The Bavarian state police did not, and so Hitler was arrested. Apparently, he was on the verge of committing suicide. One wishes that he did, but he was arrested. He was put on trial, and it was the best thing that could have happened to him because he could use the trial as a platform. There he is giving one of his speeches in the dock, and that attracted far more attention and sympathy than he otherwise would have gotten. Now, he was leading an armed rebellion against the state. That is known as treason, and generally will get you shot by firing squad, but not for Hitler. He only got 5 years in jail. He served a year of it, and he was treated like a VIP in prison. He had these special quarters. People could come and see him. He was still running the Nazi Party from prison, and it gave him the leisure to dictate his biography, which is known as Mein Kampf, which is generally translated as My Struggle. All right, and again, there he is, very stern on the cover. And it was all about his struggle, and it's just a shock full of self-pity. Everyone is out to get me. I succeeded in spite of them. So it's Hitler's personal struggle. But it's also the struggle of Germans against inferior races, okay? By this point, he's such a German nationalist, which of course is linked up with kind of 19th century Darwinian theories, all right, that the Germans are naturally the best examples of human, and of course, they're threatened by these other inferior peoples. So we have to make sure that the Germans retain their rightful place on the top. All right. So the Germans are better than the French, and they're definitely better than the Russians. But if they're not careful, these inferior people will manage to knock us off. But then there's also this parallel struggle. The Jews are not even on this racial hierarchy. The Jews are separate from humanity as such. And basically, the Jews are against all of humanity, whether Russian or French or German. All right. So there are two struggles: there's Germans versus inferior races, but it's also all of humanity versus the Jews. And if you ever get the chance to read, it's very interesting. He's not stupid. Okay, it's clearly that he's read a lot of history, and he can explain things fairly logically, obviously very tendentiously. Okay. But it's not like he doesn't have a point in some way. But when he starts talking about the Jews, it's clear that he, something in his mind, there's a switch that goes in his brain, and he just rails on for page after page about how evil the Jews are and how wicked they are. And there's never any proof. It's just sort of taken for granted that these people are up to no good. And if we don't get rid of them, bad things are going to happen to everyone. And we also read in Mein Kampf about why he chose the swastika. This was, Aryan, okay? There is an ancient people known as the Aryans, all right? They are Indo-European people. And as far as Hitler is concerned, the Aryans are sort of this, they're the true original people, and the Germans are the people who are best descended from these Aryans, okay? It doesn't make much sense. But the swastika was a symbol of the Aryans, and so the Nazis are going to resurrect it. And when they talked about Aryan, they really meant German, and they certainly meant non-Jewish. All right, so that's where the swastika comes from. It's an ancient Aryan symbol that Hitler resurrected to represent the Germans, which of course are the second coming of the Aryans. All right. The Nazis, somewhat. Hyperinflation had been tamed. In the 1928 election, the Nazis decided to contest it. They ran candidates. They got all of 2.6% of the vote. But as you are no doubt aware, the following year, there was a crash in the stock market on Wall Street, which led to a great worldwide depression. And of course, what we see is that in desperate times like extremist parties get a lot more popular. There's this sense that capitalism has failed, that liberal democracy has failed. It is time that we tried sterner measures. Either communism, which also increased its appeal, or Nazism. Right? That we need a strong leader figure to cut through all the crap and lead us to a better policy than what we've got now. And the same thing happened in Germany that happened in Italy. Okay, there were a number of elections in the early 30s, and with every election, the Nazis increased their representation in the Reichstag, that is the German parliament. But so did the communists as well. And after another government failed, there was another election. The Nazis never got a majority of the votes. It's important to remember this. But what happened is that in early 1933, business owners, capitalists, prevailed upon the president of Germany. Okay, keep in mind that, Germany is now a republic. Okay, it's known as the Weimar Republic. They've kicked out the Kaiser, right? And it's this republic. It has a president. The president is the ceremonial head of state. The president, in fact, is Paul von Hindenburg, a famous decorated World War I general. Probably more on the right than on the left, to be honest. But business owners prevailed upon him to offer the chancellorship to Hitler. Chancellor is basically like the head of government or the prime minister. And of course, business owners, they don't think much of Hitler. They think he's a buffoon. They think he's a clown. They think his anti-Semitism is ridiculous. I mean, what's the point? I mean, Jews are... they're very clever, and a lot of business owners are Jewish, and it's a great deal from the Jews. They don't understand why Hitler is so against them. They figured that if they offered Hitler the chancellorship, that they could control him, that he would grow up once he got in power, and that there would be enough opposition to him that some of his more extreme statements would never be enacted into policy. Unfortunately for them, Hitler was not to be controlled. Hitler was, say what you will about him, he was a political genius. He was able to recognize weakness in an opponent and to exploit it. He recognized the situation, and he very deftly maneuvered to consolidate power. And he started out with the communists, all right, who were never, there's a certain appeal to communism, but there's a great deal of fear of communism, and so he exploited that. Upon being named chancellor, he immediately banned communist newspapers. Okay, so there's no freedom of speech, obviously, in the Weimar Republic. And then, less than a month later, there was a great godsend to uh, to the Nazis. As it turns out, a Dutch socialist by the name of Martinus van der Lubbe set fire to the Reichstag. Okay, now the communists don't really, excuse me, the Nazis don't really have any time for the Reichstag, right? It's a parliament, isn't it? But it is a symbol of the German nation. And so they certainly moved to exploit the Reichstag fire. In fact, some people think that they even set the Reichstag fire, and then they arrested Martinus van der Lubbe and said, "You did this." Okay. So yeah, so this is actually a trope. You see this after 9/11. Some people who felt that 9/11 was an inside job were talking about 9/11 as Bush's Reichstag fire. Okay, that it was something that he contrived in order to consolidate his power. Personally, I think that's a irresponsible thing to say. And in general, I think most historians say that yes, Martinus van der Lubbe really did set the Reichstag fire. It was certainly taken advantage of by the Nazis. In the wake of this, they set up concentration camps and they started sending communists to these concentration camps, allegedly for their own protection. All right? And sure enough, a month after that, the Nazis bullied the Reichstag into granting them the Enabling Act. Okay, so basically Hitler can now make laws without the permission of the Reichstag. So anti-Semitic policy the Nazis continue to be anti-Semitic. They don't launch immediately into anti-Semitic policy. There is a Jewish boycott on April 1st, 1933. Kauf nicht bei Juden, okay, buy not from the Jews. It wasn't particularly successful. I mean, but they didn't try much beyond that at the first. I mean, there's a lot of popular prejudice against Jews, but it wasn't. It's not like you had later, and I think some Jews kind of breathed a sigh of relief. Then they're like, "Oh well, this won't be nearly as bad as we fear." But they continued to be Nazis in other ways. On May 10th, 1933, there was one of their famous book burnings. All right. Again, there is no freedom of speech or freedom of thought in a totalitarian government. All right. You're only going to allow ideas that the party approves of. And there's all kinds of people who have ideas that the Nazis don't approve of. Anyone who favors parliamentary democracy, anyone who says the First World War was a mistake, anyone who's communist, all right, anyone who preaches peace. All these books are bad books. And so on May 10th, 1933, members of the Nazi Party are going to come into bookshops and libraries and just take the books they disapprove of and have a big fire, a big bonfire in the middle of the town square, burning up these books and hopefully the ideas that they represented. And one of the famous Nazis, Hermann Goering, all right, allegedly said, when I hear the word culture, I reach for my Browning, all right? In other words, it's kind of like people who oppose the National Endowment for the Arts because they think that the NEA supports degeneracy and filth. All right, that a lot of art sponsored by the NEA is just really does not reflect well on the human condition. It's all about shocking people for no real reason. Okay, and I'm afraid to say there was a lot of stuff like that in the Weimar Republic, and Hermann Goering he's one of the people who's going to put an end to that. Right? Okay, so that's a flavor of what's in store for us from the Nazis. Remember what happened in the Soviet Union in the 30s? Stalin moved to purge anyone from the Bolshevik Party, who knew a time before Stalin. He did not want to tolerate anyone in the party who might oppose him. And Hitler saw that and thought that that was a good idea. So what we have is the so-called Night of the Long Knives between June 30th and July 1st, 1934. Remember the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts were part of the Nazi movement from the very beginning. Okay, Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA, felt he was on particularly good terms with Hitler, felt that Hitler owed him one. Okay, but Hitler is not going to be beholden to anyone. Thank you very much. And the way to get rid of people, if you're a Nazi, is to kill them. And so that's what happened. The Night of the Long Knives, basically, it was a big plot to arrest and to kill about 1,000 members of the SA. So they took out the top leadership and completely neutered it because, you know, there's no way that the SA have any claims now on Hitler's attention. So that's how Hitler does things. He's basically like a mob boss. And, you know, again, the Weimar Constitution was kind of written in pencil and paper. And so what we had in August 2nd, 1934 is the death of Paul von Hindenburg. Hitler simply took the opportunity to combine the offices of Chancellor and President and create, and of course he's going to occupy both offices, and he calls himself the Führer, basically the leader. Okay, just as Mussolini calls himself Il Duce, Hitler calls himself the Führer. All right, and we'll leave him there, and we'll discuss more about Hitler next time.